The first time I heard about the Wailing Oaks, I was sitting in a nursing home in Asheville, North Carolina, listening to a 97-year-old man named Earl Hutchins tell me something that would fundamentally change how I understood the logging industry in Appalachia. Earl's hand shook as he gripped his coffee mug, but his eyes were sharp and clear when he leaned forward and whispered, "They weren't trees, son. That's what we told ourselves. But deep down, every man who worked those mountains knew the truth." This wasn't the story I'd come to hear. I was researching the economic impact of early 20th century logging operations for my dissertation. I expected dates, production numbers, maybe some colorful anecdotes about camp life. What I got instead was something else entirely, and I'm still not sure what to make of it. Earl died 3 weeks after our interview. Before he passed, he made me promise to talk to the others, the few remaining men who'd worked the camps in the Nantahala National Forest between 1900 and 1903. He gave me a list of 7 names. By the time I tracked them all down, only 4 were still alive, and they all told me variations of the same impossible story. What follows is my attempt to piece together what actually happened in those mountains. I've corroborated what I could through historical records, newspaper archives, and personal journals. Some of this I can verify. Some of it defies verification, and some of it, frankly, I wish I'd never heard at all. But here's what I know for certain. In the autumn of 1900, the Buchanan Lumber Company sent 73 men into the remote hollows of western North Carolina to clear-cut virgin timber. By Christmas of 1903, the operation shut down permanently, despite sitting on some of the most valuable hardwood in the entire Appalachian range. The official reason given was unworkable terrain and labor disputes. That was a lie. The truth is so much stranger, and it starts with a sound that grown men said made their teeth ache and their bones feel hollow. Thomas Buchanan was a bastard, but he was a successful bastard, and in 1900 that's all that mattered in the lumber business. He'd made his fortune clear-cutting the forests of Pennsylvania and West Virginia, leaving behind stumps and erosion and towns that would die the moment the timber ran out. He didn't care. There was always another mountain, another forest, another fortune to be extracted from the earth. The Nantahala Tract was supposed to be his masterpiece. Over 50,000 acres of old-growth timber, white oak and hickory and chestnut trees, so massive that some of them were already standing when Columbus landed. The locals said the forest was older than memory, which should have been the first warning sign, but men like Buchanan didn't listen to mountain people. They were superstitious, backwards, obstacles to progress. He hired Samuel Yates to run the operation. Yates was a foreman who'd worked for Buchanan in West Virginia, a hard man who pushed crews to exhaustion and didn't tolerate complaints. He was efficient, ruthless, and completely unprepared for what he'd find in those mountains. The first crew arrived in September 1900. 40 men, most of them immigrants from Poland and Italy who barely spoke English, along with a dozen locals who knew the terrain. They set up camp along Tallulah Creek, built bunkhouses and a commissary, and started surveying the forest. That's when they found the grove. It was Samuel Yates himself who first walked into that stand of white oaks. He described it later in a letter to Buchanan, and I found that letter in the company archives at Duke University. His handwriting gets shaky in certain passages, the letters cramped and uneven, like he was writing with a trembling hand. The trees in the northern hollow differ from standard white oak in several respects, he wrote. They are larger, averaging 6 to 8 feet in diameter and exceeding 100 feet in height. The bark has an unusual texture, almost smooth in places, and displays patterning that resembles, though I know how this will sound, human features in distress. The grain is extraordinarily dense, which should make for excellent lumber, but the wood has a peculiar quality. It seems almost warm to the touch, even in cool weather, and when struck with an axe, it produces a sound unlike any timber I've encountered. What kind of sound? Yates doesn't say in that first letter, but Earl Hutchins did 74 years later in that nursing home. It screamed, Earl told me, not like wind through branches or wood splitting. It screamed like a person, like someone being murdered. The practical among you are already formulating explanations. Peculiar wood density creating unusual resonance, wind patterns in the hollow, acoustic anomalies. I thought the same things. I wanted to think the same things, But here's the problem. Every single man who worked that camp described the same sound, and every single one of them said it didn't sound like anything natural. It sounded like agony. For the first month, the operation proceeded normally. The crew worked the outer sections of the forest, cutting and hauling timber down to the creek where it would be floated downstream. Production was good. The men were uneasy about the grove, but Yates told them to focus on easier sections first. They'd get to those big oaks eventually, once they'd built up their confidence and their infrastructure. That's what he told Buchanan anyway. The truth, according to the men who were there, is that Yates was stalling. He'd go into that grove of oaks almost every day, walking among the trees, touching them, listening. He started acting strange, withdrawn. He stopped eating in the commissary with the other men, preferring to take his meals alone in his cabin. One of the local workers, a man named Jesse Treadway, told me that Yates would talk to himself while inspecting the trees. Or maybe he wasn't talking to himself. Maybe he was talking to them. The first casualty happened on October 17, 1900. A Polish immigrant named Piotr Kowalski was working with a felling crew about a quarter-mile from the grove when a widowmaker, a hanging branch, fell and crushed his skull. Widowmakers were a common hazard in logging, but several men claimed that there was no wind that day, and the branch that killed Piotr had fallen from a tree they hadn't even touched. Jesse Treadway said something else, something that didn't make it into any official report. The tree that dropped the branch was a white oak, and just before the branch fell, Jesse heard it make a sound. A low, groaning sound that reminded him of someone breathing. Yates wrote it off as an accident. These things happened. He reported it to Buchanan, who sent a payment to Kowalski's widow and told Yates to be more careful. The operation continued. 2 weeks later, a fight broke out in the bunkhouse. One of the Italian workers, Antonio Rossi, attacked another man with a felling axe, screaming in Italian. The other workers subdued him, and when Yates questioned him the next morning, Antonio claimed he'd had a dream. In the dream, he was cutting down one of the big oaks in the grove, and when the tree fell, he saw that it had a face in the trunk. A woman's face, twisted in agony, mouth open in a scream. And the woman in the tree was his mother, who had died in Italy 10 years earlier. Antonio was never quite right after that. He refused to work, spending his days sitting outside the bunkhouse, staring toward the grove. Eventually, Yates sent him down the mountain. According to records I found, Antonio Rossi was admitted to the Western North Carolina Insane Asylum in November 1900, where he died 6 months later. The cause of death was listed as melancholia and self-starvation. That should have been enough for Yates to shut down the operation, or at least to avoid the grove entirely. There were tens of thousands of other trees they could cut. But Buchanan was pushing for production, and those oaks represented a fortune. The wood was perfect, dense and straight-grained, worth twice what the other hardwoods would bring. So in early November, Yates made the decision to begin cutting the grove. That's when things got really bad. The first tree took 4 men an entire day to cut, not because it was particularly large, though it was massive, but because the men kept stopping. They'd make a few cuts, then back away, shaking their heads, complaining of headaches and nausea. The sound the wood made when struck was too much for them. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was viscerally wrong, triggering some deep, primal part of their brains that screamed danger. Earl Hutchins was one of those 4 men. He was 17 years old, a local boy who'd taken the job to help support his family. He told me that the wood felt warm under his hands, almost feverish, and that with every cut of the saw, he felt like he was doing something evil. It wasn't just sound, Earl said, his old hands tightening on the coffee mug. The tree bled. I know how that sounds. Trees don't bleed, but this one did. The sap that came out was red, dark red like blood, and it was warm, hot even, and the smell. Christ, the smell was like copper and rot, like something dead. They got the tree down just before dark. When it hit the ground, every man in the camp heard it. Not just the crash of wood hitting earth, but something else. A sound that Earl described as the worst scream I've ever heard, and I fought in World War I, so that's saying something. 3 men quit that night. They packed their belongings and walked down the mountain in the dark, refusing to stay even one more night. Yates let them go. He was starting to look haunted himself, his face pale and drawn, dark circles under his eyes. The next morning, they found the tree they'd cut had moved. This is where the story crosses from unsettling into impossible, and I struggled with whether to include it. But 4 different men told me the same thing, independently, and I found a reference to it in Yates's letters. The tree they'd felled was no longer where it had fallen. It had shifted during the night, rolling about 20 feet back toward the grove, toward the stump it had been cut from. Must have been on a slope, you're thinking. Gravity, ground settling, something rational. Except the ground was level, and the tree hadn't rolled downhill. It had rolled uphill. Yates ordered his men to limb the tree and cut it into sections for hauling. They worked quickly, nervously, and by late afternoon they had the tree processed. But that night in the bunkhouse, one of the men started screaming. His name was Jakub Nowak, another Polish immigrant, and he was pointing at the door, shrieking in Polish. The other men looked, and they saw what Jakub saw. Standing in the doorway was a woman. She was naked, her skin pale as birch bark, and her mouth was open impossibly wide. She had no eyes, just dark hollows, and she was making a sound. A wailing, keening sound that made grown men cover their ears and curl into fetal positions. Then she was gone. Several men claimed they ran outside, searching for her, but found nothing. No footprints in the mud, no sign anyone had been there. Jakub Nowak refused to sleep in the bunkhouse after that. He built a rough shelter near the creek and stayed there, alone, until he disappeared 3 weeks later. They found his body in the spring of 1901 at the base of a cliff about 2 miles from camp. The official ruling was accidental death, but Jesse Treadway told me that when they brought Jacob's body down, his face was frozen in an expression of pure terror, and his hands were worn to the bone like he'd been trying to claw his way out of something. This is a good point to address what you're probably thinking. Mass hysteria. Shared delusion. A group of men, isolated in the mountains, working a dangerous job, feeding off each other's fears and superstitions until they created a collective nightmare. It's a reasonable explanation, and it's what I told myself for a long time, but it doesn't account for the physical evidence. In December 1900, a photographer named William Shepard arrived at the camp. Buchanan had sent him to document the operation for potential investors. Shepard spent 3 days at the camp, and he took over 40 photographs. Most of them are standard logging operation pictures: men with axes, felled trees, the camp buildings. But 3 of his photographs show the grove. I've seen these photographs. They're held in a private collection in Asheville, owned by Shepard's granddaughter. She let me examine them on the condition that I not reproduce them, and I've honored that promise. But I can describe what I saw. The trees are wrong. I don't know how else to put it. In the photographs, the bark of the oaks displays patterns that look disturbingly like faces. Not vague, pareidolia faces that you might see in wood grain or clouds. Detailed faces with expressions of anguish and fear. Some appear to be screaming. It could be a trick of light and shadow, I told myself. Except the faces appear in multiple photographs, taken at different times of day, from different angles, and they're not always the same faces. In one photograph, a particular tree shows a face that looks like an old man. In another photograph of the same tree, taken the next day, the face looks like a young woman. Shepard himself left a note with the photographs, written in shaky handwriting. I am a rational man of science, but I cannot explain what I witnessed in those mountains. The trees are not natural. I have developed these photographs 3 times, certain that I had made some error in exposure or processing, but the images remain consistent. God forgive me for what I've documented. William Shepard died by suicide in 1903. He drank arsenic in his studio in Asheville. He left no note, but his wife told the police that he'd been having nightmares since returning from the lumber camp, dreams of being trapped inside a tree, unable to move or scream, just endlessly aware and suffering. By January 1901, the operation was in crisis. 15 men had quit or disappeared. Production had slowed to a crawl. The men who remained were jumpy, prone to fights, sleeping badly. Yates had cut a total of 9 trees from the grove, and every single one had been accompanied by incidents. After the 3rd tree fell, one of the local workers claimed he saw his dead father standing at the edge of the woods, beckoning him. After the fifth tree, two men got into a fight and one stabbed the other with a hunting knife, leaving him badly wounded. After the seventh tree, the camp's horses broke free from their corral and ran off into the forest. They found one horse 3 days later, dead at the bottom of a ravine. The others were never recovered, and the sounds got worse. At night, the men could hear wailing coming from the grove, a chorus of voices raised in grief and pain. Some men claimed the wails sounded like words, though they couldn't quite make them out. Others said they heard their own names being called from the darkness. Yates wrote to Buchanan, begging for permission to abandon the grove and work other sections of the forest. Buchanan's response was blunt. "I am paying you to extract timber, not to indulge in mountain superstitions. Those oaks represent valuable lumber. Cut them." So Yates cut them, and his men started dying. The first clear death attributed to the grove happened on February 14, 1901. Valentine's Day, ironically. A worker named Henry Marsh was helping process one of the felled oaks, using a two-man saw to cut the trunk into sections. The saw bound in the wood, which was unusual given how skilled Henry was, and as he tried to work it free, the blade snapped. A 6-foot section of steel whipped around and caught Henry across the throat, nearly decapitating him. The other worker on the saw, a man named Robert Cross, said that just before the blade snapped, he heard Henry gasp. When Robert looked up, Henry's eyes were wide and terrified, staring at something on the tree trunk. Robert looked and saw, just for a moment, a face in the wood grain. A woman's face, beautiful and terrible, with black eyes and a mouth stretched in a silent scream. Then the blade snapped and Henry was dying, blood pumping from his severed throat, and the face in the wood was gone. They buried Henry next to Piotr Kowalski in a small cemetery they'd established near the camp. That night, every man in the camp heard singing. A woman's voice, high and clear and impossibly sad, singing something in a language none of them recognized. The singing came from the direction of the cemetery, and it went on until dawn. In the morning, they found Henry's grave disturbed, not dug up exactly, but the earth had cracked and sunken as if something had pulled the body down deeper into the ground. And growing from the center of the grave was a small white oak sapling, already 3 feet tall, which should have been impossible. Oak trees don't grow that fast. Yates ordered the sapling cut down. The man he assigned to do it, a local named Ezra Coffey, refused. "That ain't natural," Ezra said. "That tree's got Henry in it somehow. I ain't cutting it." Yates tried to do it himself, but when he approached the grave with an axe, he collapsed. The men who rushed to help him said he was ice cold, his lips blue, his eyes rolled back in his head. He came around after a few minutes, gasping and shaking, and refused to explain what had happened. But he never went near that grave again, and he never ordered anyone else to cut the sapling. By spring, the sapling was 20 feet tall. Now here's where the story takes a turn that I still struggle to reconcile with any rational worldview. What I'm about to tell you comes from multiple sources, cross-referenced and verified as much as possible. But it remains so bizarre that I've questioned my own research methodology. In March of 1901, a woman arrived at the logging camp. She walked up the mountain alone, carrying nothing but a walking stick, and when she reached the camp, she asked to speak to Samuel Yates. The men who saw her described her as ancient, possibly Cherokee or mixed heritage, with long white hair and eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. Her name was Mary Crow, and she told Yates that she had come to warn him. "You are cutting the crying trees," she said, according to Jesse Treadway's account. "The crying trees have stood in that hollow for longer than there have been white men in these mountains. They hold the grief of my people, the sorrow and pain of hundreds of years. Every tear, every scream, every death. The trees remember." Yates, to his credit, listened. By this point, he was desperate enough to consider anything. "What are they?" he asked. "A prison," Mary said, "and a mercy. When the first white men came with their diseases and their guns, our people died in numbers you cannot imagine. Whole villages gone in a season. The grief was too much for the land to bear, too much for the living to carry. So the medicine women did what they had to do. They put the grief into the trees. All the pain, all the sorrow, all the rage of the dead. The trees took it willingly, held it, kept it from poisoning the land and the living. "That's impossible," Yates said, because what else could he say? "You've seen the faces," Mary replied. "You've heard the screams. You know what you're cutting. Every tree you fell releases what it holds. The grief is spilling out, looking for somewhere to go, someone to inhabit. That's why your men are dying. That's why they're going mad. You're not just cutting trees, you're opening graves." Yates asked her what he should do. Mary's answer was simple. "Stop. Leave the crying trees alone. Cut the other forest if you must, but leave those trees standing." Then she walked back down the mountain, and no one ever saw her again. I tried to verify Mary Crow's existence. I found no records of her in any census, no birth or death certificates, nothing. She's a ghost in the historical record, appearing only in the accounts of the men who saw her that day. But those accounts are consistent in every detail: her appearance, her words, her warning. And here's the thing that troubles me most. Yates believed her. He wrote to Buchanan that same day, a letter I found in the archives, urging him to halt operations in the grove. "There is something wrong with these trees," he wrote. "I cannot explain it scientifically, but I know it in my bones. We need to stop." Buchanan's response arrived 2 weeks later. "I am not paying you to consult with mountain witches. Those trees will be cut, or you will be replaced." So Yates kept cutting, and the death toll kept rising. Between March and August of 1901, 7 more men died or disappeared. I won't detail all of them because the pattern becomes grimly repetitive. Accidents that seemed almost deliberate, tools failing at precisely the wrong moment, men seeing things that drove them to violence or madness. But I need to tell you about what happened to Samuel Yates himself, because it's central to understanding why the operation finally stopped. By late summer, Yates was barely recognizable as the hard, efficient foreman who'd arrived a year earlier. He'd lost weight, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken and red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He'd taken to drinking heavily, which was noticed because he'd previously been a teetotaler. And he was having conversations with people who weren't there. Jesse Treadway told me that Yates would stand at the edge of the grove for hours, talking to the trees. Sometimes he was apologizing, sometimes he was arguing. Sometimes he was just listening, his head cocked to one side, nodding as if in response to something only he could hear. On August 12, 1901, Yates went into the grove alone. He told his assistant foreman he needed to survey which trees to cut next. He took a flask of whiskey and a pistol, which should have been the first warning sign. But by that point, everyone was armed and drinking, so it didn't seem unusual. He didn't come back. They found him the next morning, sitting at the base of one of the massive white oaks, the pistol in his lap, the flask empty beside him. He was alive, but he wasn't responsive. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, and he was making a sound. A low, continuous wailing that sounded like wind through bare branches. They carried him down to the camp and then down the mountain to the nearest doctor in Fontana. The doctor couldn't find anything physically wrong with Yates, but he wasn't there mentally. He just sat, staring, wailing that terrible sound. Eventually, they committed him to the same asylum where Antonio Rossi had died. Yates lived for another 17 years, but he never spoke another word. He never stopped wailing. The nurses at the asylum said it was the saddest sound they'd ever heard, and that sometimes, on quiet nights, other patients would start wailing too, as if in response. Samuel Yates died in 1918 during the influenza pandemic. According to his death certificate, his last words were, "Please let me out." After Yates's breakdown, Buchanan sent a new foreman, a man named William Garrett. Garrett lasted 3 weeks. He quit after one of his workers was found dead inside a hollow tree, somehow having crawled or been pulled into a cavity barely large enough for a child. The man's face was frozen in an expression of terror, and his fingernails were torn off from trying to claw his way out. The third foreman, Daniel Price, brought a priest with him. Father Michael O'Connor from the Catholic Church in Asheville. Father O'Connor blessed the grove, performed prayers, sprinkled holy water on the trees. The next morning, Father O'Connor was found dead in his tent. His rosary wrapped so tightly around his neck that it had embedded in the flesh. The official cause of death was suicide, but every man in the camp knew better. Father O'Connor's face was purple and swollen, his eyes bulged out, but his hands were at his sides, uninjured. He couldn't have strangled himself with the rosary, not like that. After the priest's death, 15 men quit in a single day. Buchanan sent replacements, but word had spread. The Buchanan camp was cursed, people said. The forest was haunted. No amount of money was worth working there. By the end of 1902, Buchanan had gone through 4 more foremen. Production had slowed to almost nothing. The men who remained were there because they had no other options, and they refused to go anywhere near the grove. They cut trees on the periphery, hauled timber, but the Wailing Oaks stood untouched. And every night the camp could hear them. The wailing that gave them their name, rising from the grove like a chorus of the damned. Some nights it was quiet enough to ignore. Other nights it was so loud that men couldn't sleep, stuffing rags in their ears, getting drunk just to drown it out. The end came in December 1903. Thomas Buchanan himself arrived at the camp, furious at the delays and losses. He'd invested a fortune in the operation and had almost nothing to show for it. He announced that he would personally oversee the cutting of the remaining oaks in the grove. The workers begged him not to. The current foreman, a man named Patrick Sullivan, tried to explain what had been happening, the deaths and disappearances and strange phenomena. Buchanan dismissed it all as superstition and cowardice. On the morning of December 19, 1903, Buchanan took a team of 12 men into the grove. He'd selected the largest remaining oak, a monster of a tree at least 8 feet in diameter, and he intended to cut it down himself. Jesse Treadway was one of those 12 men. He told me that Buchanan was in a fury, screaming at the workers, calling them weak and cowardly. He took up an axe himself and struck the tree, and when he did, something happened that Jesse struggled to describe even 70 years later. The tree screamed, Jesse said, not like the others had. This was different, louder, more aware, like it knew what was happening and was terrified. And when Buchanan pulled the axe free, blood came out. Real blood, bright red, hot, pumping out of the cut like it had a heartbeat. Buchanan stared at the blood on his hands. Then he laughed. "Sap," he said. "It's just red sap. Keep cutting." But none of the other men would move. They stood frozen, watching the blood pour from the tree, pooling at its base, steaming in the cold December air. Buchanan cursed them and struck the tree again, and with each blow the tree screamed louder and more blood flowed, until Buchanan was standing ankle-deep in it. Then the tree moved. I know how this sounds. I've questioned Jesse Treadway's memory, considered that he might have been exaggerating or misremembering, but he wasn't the only witness. I tracked down 2 other men who were there that day. One was in a nursing home in Tennessee, suffering from dementia, but in his lucid moments, he told the same story. The other was living in Florida, sharp as a tack at 93, and he corroborated every detail. The tree moved. The branches bent down, impossibly, defying physics and biology, and they wrapped around Thomas Buchanan. He screamed as the branches pulled him upward, lifting him off the ground. The other men stood paralyzed, watching as Buchanan was drawn into the canopy of the tree, his screams echoing through the hollow. They could see him struggling, see the branches tightening around him, and then they saw the tree open. The trunk split, revealing a hollow interior that glowed with a soft reddish light. And inside that hollow, they could see faces. Dozens of faces, maybe hundreds, pressed against the inside of the tree, like they were trapped behind glass, mouths open in silent screams. The branches pulled Buchanan toward that opening, and he was fighting, clawing at the wood, screaming for help. The men below finally broke free of their paralysis and grabbed axes, trying to cut him free, but when they struck the tree, their axes bounced off as if hitting stone. Then Buchanan was pulled inside the tree, and the trunk closed behind him. His screaming didn't stop. They could hear him inside the tree, muffled but clear, crying for help, begging to be let out. They tried everything. They cut at the tree for hours, but they couldn't even scratch the bark. They built a fire at the base, but the wood wouldn't burn. They brought explosives up from the camp and tried to blast it open, but the dynamite had no effect. All the while, Buchanan's screaming continued. For 3 days, they could hear him inside that tree. His voice growing hoarse and desperate, and then fading to a weak, whimpering plea. On the 4th day, the screaming stopped, but something else appeared. On the trunk of the tree, at about chest height, a new pattern emerged in the bark. A face. Thomas Buchanan's face, frozen in an expression of absolute terror, mouth open in a scream that would never end. The camp evacuated that same day. Every man packed his belongings and walked down the mountain, leaving tools and equipment behind. Patrick Sullivan sent a telegram to Buchanan's business partners in Philadelphia, explaining that Thomas Buchanan was dead and the operation was finished. There was a brief investigation. Local authorities went up to the grove and saw the tree with Buchanan's face in it. Their official report, which I found in county records, states that they found evidence of unusual bark patterning, but no body. They concluded that Buchanan must have wandered off and died of exposure, and that the workers had panicked and abandoned the camp. The lumber company tried to resume operations in 1904, but they couldn't find workers willing to go up the mountain. The camp was abandoned and eventually reclaimed by the forest. The equipment rusted and rotted where it stood, and the Wailing Oaks still stand. I know this because I've been there. I need to be honest with you about something. This started as academic research, but it became personal. After interviewing Earl Hutchins and the others, after reading Yates's letters and seeing Shepard's photographs, I needed to see the grove for myself. I hiked into the Nantahala National Forest last autumn, following old logging roads and faded trails, using GPS coordinates I'd pieced together from historical maps and survey records. It took me 2 days to find it, but I found it. The grove is there, exactly as described. About 40 white oaks, massive and ancient, standing in a small hollow surrounded by newer forest. The trees are immediately recognizable because they're different from everything around them. Larger, yes, but also somehow more present, more real, as if they occupy space more intensely than normal trees. And the bark. God, the bark. I saw the faces. I tried to tell myself it was pareidolia, pattern recognition run amok, but I couldn't maintain that denial. The faces are too clear, too detailed, too expressive. I counted at least 20 distinct faces on the trees I could see clearly, and every one of them looked terrified or anguished or grief-stricken. I found the tree, Buchanan's tree. It's the largest in the grove, and yes, his face is still there. 121 years later, Thomas Buchanan's face stares out from the bark, mouth open in an eternal scream. I touched the tree. I know I shouldn't have, but I did. The bark was warm, slightly warmer than it should have been on a cool October day. And I swear I felt it pulse under my hand, like a heartbeat, slow and faint but unmistakable. I didn't hear any wailing while I was there. It was midday, bright and clear, and the forest was quiet except for normal bird and insect sounds. But I only stayed for an hour. I took photographs, made notes, and got out. I developed the photographs when I got home, and they show the trees, the faces, all of it. I've looked at those photos for hours, trying to find some natural explanation, and I can't. I just can't. So what are we to make of all this? What possible explanation can account for trees that bleed and scream, that trap people inside them, that somehow hold the faces and maybe the souls of the dead? Let me give you the rational explanations first, the ones I desperately wanted to believe. Mass hysteria and collective delusion, as I mentioned earlier. Except this doesn't explain the physical evidence, the photographs, the documented deaths, the tree with Buchanan's face that still stands today and that I've personally seen and photographed. Rare geological or biological phenomena. Maybe the trees grew in soil with unusual mineral content that created strange acoustic properties and bark patterns. Except I've had geologists look at soil samples from the area and there's nothing unusual. And the bark patterns are too specific, too detailed to be random mineral staining. Deliberate fraud. Maybe the whole thing was a scam, a way to shut down an unprofitable operation and blame it on supernatural causes. Except the company lost a fortune on this venture, and there's no evidence anyone profited from the closure. Also, it doesn't explain why the trees still display these features today, long after everyone involved is dead. Here's what I think, and you're free to dismiss this as the delusion of someone who's spent too long chasing ghosts in archives and forests. I think Mary Crow was telling the truth. The historical record supports the idea that Native American populations in Appalachia were devastated by disease and violence in the centuries after European contact. Some estimates suggest that up to 90% of indigenous people died within a few generations. That's not hundreds or thousands of deaths. That's hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people across the Americas. The grief from that kind of loss, the sheer magnitude of suffering, where does it go? How do the survivors process it? How does the land absorb it? Maybe they found a way to contain it. Maybe the trees were willing participants in some kind of spiritual technology we don't understand, some practice that predates and exists outside our scientific framework. Maybe the oaks in that grove are not just trees, but living vessels, holding the accumulated sorrow and rage and pain of people who died screaming, who watched their children die, who saw everything they knew destroyed. And maybe when you cut those trees, when you wound them, you release what they're holding. The grief spills out, looking for somewhere to go, and it finds the living people nearby. It gets into them, manifests as madness and violence and despair, and sometimes, rarely, it's strong enough to pull someone inside, to trap them in the tree, to add them to the chorus of the suffering. This is the part where I'm supposed to tell you I don't actually believe this, that I'm just presenting it as one possible interpretation. But I'd be lying. I've seen too much, talked to too many people, stood in that grove and felt the wrongness of it. I believe the Wailing Oaks are real. I believe they hold something we don't have words for, something that exists in the intersection of ecology and spirituality and collective trauma. And I believe the loggers were right to stop cutting them. There's an important lesson here, beyond the horror story, beyond the impossible events. It's about respect and humility in the face of things we don't understand. The logging industry of the early 1900s operated on a simple principle: nature exists to be exploited. Trees are just resources to be extracted. Land is just terrain to be conquered. The thoughts and warnings of local people, especially indigenous people, were dismissed as superstition and ignorance. This attitude has caused immeasurable damage, not just to forests, but to ecosystems worldwide. And while the Wailing Oaks represent an extreme and possibly unique case, they're also a metaphor for a larger truth. There are things in this world, in nature and culture and human experience, that deserve reverence rather than exploitation. The loggers stopped cutting the Wailing Oaks because they were forced to recognize that not everything can or should be commodified. Sometimes the price of progress is too high. Sometimes the old ways, the traditional knowledge, the warnings of people who've lived with the land for generations are worth listening to. I think about Thomas Buchanan a lot. By all accounts, he was not a good man. He destroyed forests, displaced communities, valued profit over human life. But did he deserve his fate, to be trapped inside a tree for eternity, conscious and aware and suffering? I don't know, but I do know that his hubris, his absolute certainty that he knew better than everyone else, his refusal to listen or show respect, led directly to his destruction. There's a cautionary tale in that. The grove still stands today. It's on national forest land, protected from commercial logging by federal regulations. But it's not designated as a special area or given any particular protection beyond what all national forest land receives. As far as the Forest Service is concerned, it's just another stand of old-growth oak. I've debated whether I should reveal the exact location. Part of me wants to protect it, to keep people away. Those trees should be left alone, undisturbed, allowed to do whatever it is they're doing without interference. But another part of me wants people to know. I want biologists to study the trees, historians to investigate the claims, skeptics to try to debunk the story. I want the truth, whatever it is, to be examined in the light rather than hidden in the shadows. In the end, I'm not going to publish GPS coordinates or detailed directions. But I will say this: if you're determined enough, if you're willing to do the research and the hiking, you can find the grove. And if you do, I have some advice. Don't touch the trees. Don't mark them. Don't cut samples. Don't try to damage them in any way. Show respect. This is not a tourist attraction. It's a graveyard, or a prison, or maybe something we don't have words for. Treat it accordingly. Don't go alone, and don't go at night. Whatever presence or force resides in those trees seems to be more active in darkness. If you hear wailing, leave immediately. Don't investigate, don't try to record it, just go. And if you see faces in the bark that weren't there when you arrived, if you see your own face starting to emerge in the wood grain, run. Get as far away as fast as you can, and don't look back. I want to end by returning to Earl Hutchins, the 97-year-old man who first told me this story. 3 weeks after our interview, his daughter called to tell me he'd passed away peacefully in his sleep. But she also told me something else. The night before he died, Earl woke up screaming. When his daughter rushed into his room, he was sitting up in bed, staring at the wall, tears streaming down his face. He told her that he could hear them, the trees, singing. He said they were calling his name, that they'd been calling for him since 1900 and that he was ready to answer. She calmed him down, gave him his medication, and he went back to sleep. In the morning, he was dead. At Earl's funeral, his daughter gave me something. A small wooden box that Earl had kept on his dresser for as long as she could remember. Inside was a piece of wood about the size of a playing card, cut from white oak. The grain in the wood formed a pattern that looked like a woman's face, beautiful and sad. There was a note with it, in Earl's handwriting, cut from the first tree we felled, November 1900. I kept it to remember. I kept it to never forget what we did. The face appeared 3 days after I cut the piece. It wasn't there before. Her name was Morning Dove. She told me in a dream. She's been with me all these years. I think she's forgiven me. I hope she has. I still have that piece of wood. I keep it in my desk drawer, and sometimes I take it out and look at it. The face is still there, clear as the day Earl saw it appear. And sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I think I can hear her. A soft, sad sound, like wind through leaves, like someone crying a long way away. The Wailing Oaks stand in their hollow in the Nantahala forest, and they will stand long after we're all gone. They hold their grief, their prisoners, their memories. They remind us that there are forces in this world we don't understand, places we shouldn't go, things we shouldn't disturb. The loggers learned that lesson the hard way, and they stopped cutting the trees. Not because the trees weren't valuable, not because the land wasn't accessible, but because some things are more important than profit. Some things demand respect. Sometimes the trees talk to us. The question is, are we wise enough to listen? Epilogue. I finished my dissertation, but I didn't include any of this. I wrote a conventional economic analysis of early 20th century Appalachian logging with proper citations and statistical analysis and all the academic rigor expected of a doctoral candidate. I got my PhD, but the real story, the true story, is what I've written here. I've published it now because Earl and Jesse and the others are all dead, and someone needs to tell their story before it's lost completely. Their families know, and some will probably be angry that I've made this public. I apologize for that, but I believe it's important. I haven't been back to the Grove. I tell myself it's because I'm busy with my teaching career, because it's a difficult hike, because I've seen what I needed to see. But the truth is simpler. I'm afraid. I'm afraid because sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I hear them. The Wailing Oaks singing their grief across the miles and years. And sometimes, in my dreams, I'm walking through the grove, and the trees are opening, showing me the faces inside, and they're beckoning me to join them. I'm afraid because I understand, on some deep level, what those trees are offering. An end to suffering, maybe. A place for grief to go, a way to be remembered forever, held in the wood. Part of something larger than yourself. It's a seductive thought in a way, to become part of the forest, part of the mountain, to have your pain acknowledged and contained rather than dismissed or ignored. But I'm not ready for that. Not yet. So I stay away from the grove and I try to honor the memory of the men who died there by telling their story truthfully. The Wailing Oaks are still wailing. They're still holding their grief, their rage, their memories of death and loss. And they're still waiting, patient as only trees can be patient, for the next person who doesn't listen to the warnings. Don't be that person. Listen to the trees. Respect the old stories. Believe the people who tell you that some places are sacred, some things shouldn't be touched, some forces shouldn't be disturbed. The loggers learned this lesson at a terrible cost. We'd be wise to learn from their mistakes rather than repeating them. Because the trees remember, they always remember, and they never ever forgive.